wonderful brother, John Morgan.
Thank you, Peter. I am John Morgan. I've been that way a long time. A little bit about who I am. I joined El Dorado Lodge number 8 in 1992. Interesting piece of trivia about El Dorado number 8. When I joined, and like all new odd fellows, you really don't know anything about the order when you join. You learn as you go. And one of the unique things about El Dorado 8 when I joined was the fact that we had not only 2 past Grand Masters that was in the lodge, very active, they were also past Sovereign Grand Masters in the same lodge. Now, if you think about the coincidence of that, it's probably pretty remote to find that anywhere else. Peter, I was a little surprised about some of the talks about properties and the condition of properties. And I'm not only am I chairman of the board, I'm also chairman of the property committee, so I'm the one who gets to dispose of property when it becomes available. Peter did talk about some of the properties that I've sent him to get our books and records and so forth out of, but some of them look like, at best description, a third world country would be suitable to have a piece of property in. I tried to even give away a piece of property in Southern California, and I couldn't do that because it was so pathetic. And that's the way it was taken care of, and that's the way the order, that lodge left it when we took possession of the property. But anyway, I want to spend some time today talking about the duties, roles, and whatever of trustees and directors. How many of you here are lodge trustees? Good, good. Trustees are elected every year, the same time your elected officers are, your desk officers. You need to have a minimum of 3 trustees. You could have more, but you really never need more than 7. 3 is sufficient. And I want to try to stay away from some of the negatives, but lodge trustees can't take any action on any of the assets of the lodge without the lodge members voting to authorize them to do so. But their role is to protect the assets of the lodge. The property, maintain the condition of the property. It's not their position to do that, but it's their position to make sure that it's maintained. They need to stay on top of the investments. When decisions need to be made, the trustees' report at a regular meeting should be, here's what we need to do, the lodge needs to approve it, then they can take action on that. Excuse me, I have notes, but I can't see them. The duties of trustees, is a brief description is in the Code of General Laws, Section VB6, Section 2. I think we also need to look at Robert's Code duties of trustees because it's somewhat vague in the verbiage. I think it needs to be changed because I can't find in that verbiage where the trustees are required to have lodge permission to take action. What do trustees do? They care for and preserve the property, as I said. If the lodges are going to consider a lease, signing a lease, which was discussed earlier, then the duties that the trustees have at that point is to, first of all, find out what the fair market rate is for that neighborhood, that part of the neighborhood. Fair market rate, if it's $1 a square foot, you shouldn't even consider a lease unless it's at least that or more. There are some lodges who have more than one renter or more than one leasee. When you have multiple renters, you become landlords and you get the phone calls at midnight, my hot water heater's leaking, do something now. You don't want to really, if you have a lot of leasees, like in one particular lodge, I believe they have 27 leasees. And they took it upon themselves recently to bring on board a property management company. And the advantages to a property management company is they get the phone calls at midnight. The property management companies, that's what they do for a living. Their basic rate is somewhere between 6 and 10% of whatever the revenue is that they collect. They collect the rent, they turn it over to the custodians of the lodge. I believe it was mentioned earlier that a long-term lease, anything over 1 year, you need to notify Grand Lodge of that and get the consent of Grand Lodge to sign a long-term lease. Hall associations are, a few comments about hall associations. I'm a trustee of my lodge and I'm also a trustee of our hall association. Our hall association is owned by 3 lodges, 2 Oddfellow lodges and an encampment. And each of the 3 owners supplies 3 trustees to serve on the hall association. In our hall, we're a 501c2, which is a holding company. We became a holding company because we got audited by the IRS about 7 or 8 years ago. And they were there the auditor was there for a good 3 days. The only recommendation that he had when he was finished was, you really need to be a 501c2. So, and there's some rules that go along with 501c2 corporations and directors, what you can do and what you can't do. One of the things that you can do is you can have cash on hand of your accumulated depreciation and 3 months worth of average operating expense. And if that comes to, say, $700,000, and your cash on hand exceeds that amount, you really need to give that money back to the owners, which in my case would be 3 lodges. One of the main things about being a trustee or a director is your obligation to the duty of care, trust, and loyalty, and protecting the assets. That's the predominant responsibility of trustees and directors. I'll talk a little bit about directors. There's not much difference between directors and trustees other than what's in your bylaws. We have directors in California because we're California corporations. We have articles of incorporation and bylaws, and our bylaws call for us to have directors in the cases where we have directors. We have 4 core corporations that have directors. That's the Grand Lodge, Oddfellow Homes of California, the Children's Home, and the 3 Lakes Camp. There are other boards in our organization, like the Board of Directors for an endowment cemetery. What's kind of unique about the Grand Lodge Board of Directors is it consists of 8 elected directors and 8 ex officio members. The ex officio members being the Grand Treasurer, the Grand Secretary, the Grand Master, Grand Warden, I forgot one. Okay, and then the 2 representatives of Sovereign Grand Lodge, which makes up 16 members with voice and vote. And the reason I think that we have the success that we have in California is because the 8 elected directors from Grand Lodge, their purpose is to manage the business affairs of Grand Lodge 51 weeks out of the year. The other week is when we happen to be in sessions. So the elected board members are responsible for the business side of Grand Lodge and working with the ex officio members who are responsible for the fraternal aspect of the order. And it's really difficult at Grand Lodge to make a decision without including the 2 units, the fraternal side and also the business side of Grand Lodge. And we work together collectively extremely well and have over the years. A real quick comment about what does Grand Lodge have in California. If we were to collectively add up all of the assets, and by that I mean bank accounts in the lodges, lodge properties, lodges investments, Grand Lodge's investments, properties, if we were to put all of that into one bucket, that's a sum of money that I'm not sure anybody can actually determine. But it could be in the vicinity of $400 million or more. Just our 2 homes alone, and if you haven't seen them, you should, because they're gorgeous, and both of those collectively are worth probably at least $200 million. Some qualifications to be especially a director is that you need to have some leadership skills, you need to be a decision maker, show some success as the manager of a business, some ability in organizational planning, implementation, execution, and oversight. Also an enthusiastic willingness to work as needed in the best interest of the order. Almost every year it seems like we have someone who submits their statement of qualifications to run for one of these director seats. And what surprises me is that that individual has never attended a board meeting. They have no idea what they're signing on board to do, and at least visit 2 board meetings if you want to run for that position. You need to know what you're getting into before you get there and say, uh-oh. Real quick, and I'm almost done, some do's and don'ts if you're a trustee or a director. The do's, always adhere to your board policy and mission statement. Always be on time for your meetings. Make a contribution. If you're delivered an assignment by your president or your chairman, make sure that you get it back. Ask questions. Contribute on your behalf to a collegial board meeting. I think that's a term that lawyers like to use, which means work together as a unit of one. And you should volunteer for some profit work. Are these all questions I have to answer? Yes. Some don'ts. Never try to micromanage anything that you're associated with. A good example of micromanaging would be if you're at the home board and a resident tells you that, I really didn't like my lunch today. You should take that to the executive administrator and share that with them, because that's not your responsibility to go to the kitchen staff and tell them how to fix the food. So don't be guilty of micromanaging. At board meetings or even at trustee meetings, the discussions that take place and the decisions that are made, they need to stay in that room, in that boardroom. If a vote takes place on an issue that's important or not important, and the majority of the board votes in favor of that motion, and you don't agree with it, well, get on with it, because it serves no purpose to argue that. Never take that out of the boardroom and tell someone else. That just it takes away from the credibility of what you're trying to accomplish. Any director who attempts to bring harm or cause harm to their corporation, that could be grounds for dismissal. So,
You want me to do this question?
okay.
You need help?
What are the duties of the Secretary of Trustees, and how should information be properly documented? The Secretary of the Trustees is the corporate secretary, and the minutes need to be taken as you would any boardroom or any trustees meeting. And how should the information be properly documented? The only documentation I know is the proper way to do minutes for a meeting. And my own experience in doing that is I've been the secretary of my lodge since the late 90s. And we have our board meetings, and you get those in the mail, which were the documented board meetings. Did I answer that one okay? All right. Do trustees need to maintain the chain of custody during a change of secretary? Whoever asked that question, can you verbally ask it?
there is a lodge in San Francisco that's currently,
Michael Pro.
I tried to keep an eye on that. There's a lodge in San Francisco that's currently between secretaries, and that will be shortly dealt with. There are documents and other papers that are on an off-site location. What the question is, what is the responsibility of the trustees during this whole transition to make sure that the whole property has been accounted for?
And what was the properties?
The records of the lodge.
I'm not sure that the trustees' responsibility for the records of the lodge. That's the desk officers and responsible for that. Does the lodge have any voice in things that need done? Or do the trustees have the final say? That's that's a great question. The lodge has the final vote on what happens in the lodge. The trustees don't have that. The trustees report to the lodge on the condition of the assets and recommend changes. One of the, I'm trying to stay away from some of the negatives, but we've had lodges in the past who have kowtowed to the trustees. The trustees have taken control of the lodge, and all of the funds of the lodge were turned over to the trustees. The trustees wrote the checks and paid all of the bills, and also lots of money grew legs and went somewhere else. So trustees they should never have their own bank account. There's no reason for it. Yes, sir.
How often should, let me say it loud enough. How often should the trustees report back to the lodge about finances?
What should be as needed, or at least quarterly. Well, let's say you have money that's invested at Payne Weber, and your financial manager recommends selling all of your energy stocks and putting it into AT&T and something else. Well, the trustees would examine that, and they would make a recommendation to the lodge, and the lodge would vote in favor of their recommendation. Yes, sir.
Additionally to that, would that be in paper or just verbal report?
It would be documented in the minutes. Last question I have here is, may the trustees of either a lodge or a whole association be paid for regular service? I'm a trustee of the whole association in Sacramento, and I'm also a trustee and secretary of my lodge. And as secretary of my lodge, I get $50 quarterly for mileage and expenses. And I get $20 a meeting to go to whole associations, and that's for expenses. Other than that, there are situations where there are hall managers who are on the lodge's payroll. Another thing I wanted to point out, and we'll get back to see if there's any more questions, is if you're a single lodge and you have a hall association, that's a waste of time. You do not need a hall association if you have a single lodge. Okay, any more questions? Yes.
I noticed in the organizational chart that the encampments are directly under Sovereign Grand Lodge. In the chart of organizations, the encampments are directly under Sovereign Grand Lodge. Does Grand Lodge have a revisionary interest in the property of the encampments and the patriarch's militant?
That's a good question.
No. No, Sovereign
So,
does.
Secondary to that, can a lodge transfer assets to the encampment and thus escape the reversionary interest of the Grand Lodge?
Would that really exist?
Yes.
I didn't like it.
Okay, I'm a past Grand Patriarch and past trustee of the Grand Encampment, and been involved in the encampment for a very long time.
You know you're gonna get this question.
And I was always thinking of your thinking as well. But are you talking about, it's not a clear-cut answer to your question. You can't transfer assets without permission of the Grand Lodge of California. And you have to define that. I believe there's a section, I know in the encampment, Grand Encampment per capita report, there is a section under any changes or things that affect your encampment. I think the Grand Lodge, I know we have our Grand Secretary usually asks in the letter sent to the lodges if he notices a significant drop in your assets. He wants to know why things are dropping, and those usually come in the way of the letter. Probably, definitely no, because Grand Lodge, I can't see Grand Lodge ever approving that. That you take your, let's say, Berkeley Lodge, and you give that to an encampment. I don't think that's going to happen. Or I didn't mean to point your, that was an example. But you would be hard pressed if you were making a donation of $100 to help your encampment or $1,000. Yeah, you can do that. But as far as transferring assets for the purpose of hiding money or keeping it away from another parent corporation, that's where you're going to get on shaky ground. So be very careful with that. And you have a Grand Lodge Board of Directors, very approachable. I mean, if there's something that you think that the encampment would benefit by, and the order would benefit by, in the spirit of odd fellowship, by giving it to an encampment, I could see that happening, but it's on a case-by-case basis. Simply transferring your assets and property to an encampment to keep it out of our jurisdictional Grand Lodge. And what makes you think our Grand Encampment's any better? You know, we're down to 13 encampments. We may add one here. We just have approval to add one, but as you can see in most jurisdictions, the encampments have gone away. And it's a big risk because Sovereign Grand Lodge will definitely be overseeing the assets you have through the Grand Scribe's reports to that entity. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Rick, Peter. I have another question here, and I can almost guess who it's from. Can you have a for-profit hall association? And I have to answer yes to that question because that's existed for 20 years or more. I remember in a conversation with Larry Brenner, our legal counsel, at one point, that a nonprofit corporation can own a for-profit corporation, but there are some real issues with it and restrictions. My parting comment would be to the two brothers that were up here earlier, Ray and Jay. They're kind of like the nerve center that keeps things moving, and the work that they do and the results that they achieve, we can't be grateful enough for what they do. So I think it's appropriate for them to be recognized. Thank you.
John,
Last one.
at the lodge level, at installation, why don't we obligate our trustees like we obligate our other elected officers? It's nowhere in the ritual to give the trustees the obligation.
That's a good question because we need to look at that because that's true. That just doesn't happen. There should be an obligation just like there is for directors.
I can answer.
You agree? Okay. Pete might have a better
As
answer.
you mentioned, Grand Lodge directors and trustees, there's no longer Grand Lodge trustees. We have to take an obligation. You are correct. I have been a member of lodges some of the years where, hey, our trustees need to take an obligation as well. I remember implementing an obligation for our own lodge's trustees. I would look at that on a case-by-case basis. Perhaps one of you members coming to Grand Lodge as a representative or your lodge should submit legislation and come up with a similar obligation or oath for lodge trustees, because they do have an obligation. And if you would do that, I'm sure something would be approved. I know things are in our ritual. You can address it toward trustees or directors, depending on how your lodge is set up. But there's an example of how you, as a member, if you are a representative or your lodge wants to submit legislation to change that, even in our ritual, we can send it up to Sovereign Grand Lodge and see how it likes an obligation for trustees and directors. This is a time for you to do it. Okay?
One last question.
My question is, what liabilities are there for trustees? Do trustees have questions about whether or not their personal assets can be touched? Sorry.
New trustees have questions about liabilities and whether or not their personal assets can be touched if they made a mistake as a trustee. So what are the, we know about the obligations for this discussion, but what are the liabilities for new trustees as well?
Well, there should be D&O insurance to cover those directors and trustees.
Or they're going to be in trouble.
They can be sued if they don't have the D&O insurance. Okay?
They do, and if it was to go to court, there's a good possibility that it would be dismissed if a decision was made by that organization to do something that was extraordinarily bad, and you got sued. But if the facts available at the moment that that decision was made, and that was presented to the judge could dismiss it, because there was no other decision to make at that time. Okay. Uh-oh, here comes some legal advice. While he's getting up here, earlier, I think it was Rick Boyles talked about trustees, he named up the breakdown of how many trustees. Yeah, all of those, we had 28 directors, just 28 directors, and responsible for the four corporations that we operate.
So let me just say that anyone can sue anyone. A constitutional right is you can sue anyone. So that is not a constraint. What you have to do is have insurance. And that will presumably provide legal representation and also coverage for you if a mistake has been made.
$1.85.
And I was going to add to what Grandmaster was saying is a lot of times your homeowner's insurance will have personal liability coverages in there that will protect you in your voluntary out there in the community. You need to check with your insurance policy to make sure that's so. And it's very expensive to even defend yourself against a lawsuit that you should be party to. So
Can't hear you.
Well, it's not working on that.
Thank you.
I definitely would recommend you talk to
Thank you, Brother John. Who's loud enough? Yeah, you can be sued. I've been in my position at the Oddfellows building. We've been sued 27 times in 15 years. And we only paid out once. Okay? So have insurance. Anything from a dog bite to a bulletin board falling on somebody. Be careful.